So, welcome to capsule number 2 of L3 Popular Culture in Britain since 1945, and I'm going to continue with the general historical background. What kind of society, what kind of changing society was producing the different cultural phenomena of the time. So we were up to 1951, and in 1951, after 6 years of a Labour government, the Conservatives win again, and Winston Churchill, becomes once again Prime Minister. He's no longer a very young man. Now, this, of course, was great disappointment to Labour because 1945 government had been Labour's pride and joy. They had introduced free hospitals, money for the sick, money for the unemployed, better pensions, nationalisation of the railways and the gas and the electricity and the coal and so on. So they'd really tested their programme, and yet only 6 years later they lose the elections. How can we explain this? Well, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but certainly when Mr. Churchill became Prime Minister again, he had surrounded himself by very different people. The Conservative Party had understood that it was not possible to oppose the welfare state. So where Winston Churchill had said in 1945 that nationalised medicine would have been, the National Health Service would have been a terrible thing, the first step towards fascism, he had completely stopped saying that because the welfare state was tremendously popular. And indeed, many of the social actions carried out by the Labour government were continued under the Conservatives, and there you have the example of the massive public housing programme which continued, and indeed very shortly the Conservatives will be producing 300,000 social houses per year. And these, although they might not look that impressive today, were often replacing slums, and this was often the first time that working class people had toilets inside the house rather than at the end of the garden, and so on and so forth. If we move on to 1952, again, for most years, I'm choosing one or two symbolic events to give you a flavour of the time. 1952 is the end of rationing. Rationing introduced during the war as a democratic measure, because in wartime, if you don't have rationing, then meat, for example, becomes very expensive and only the rich can buy it. Of course, when the war ended, that didn't mean that suddenly the meat industry and imports were back to normal. It took a long time, and indeed some rationing continued for 7 years. During the war itself, there had been rationing also on clothing, sugar, meats, cheese, and many other things. So this end of rationing is often considered a symbol for the moment when the British people are saying, "Okay, we're over the hardship of the war. Now we want to have a good time. We want to enjoy ourselves." And indeed, it's true that this is a period of rising prosperity. People were somewhat surprised by this because, of course, before the Second World War, you'd had the 1930s, the terrible slump, terrible depression, many millions of unemployed. And many commentators believed that after the war, things would go back to what they were before. But no, instead you got the biggest boom since capitalism had existed, which will last around 30 years. The other symbolic event of 1952 is the first British test of her atom bomb, the British atom bomb, off the West Australian coast. Not so nice for the West Australians. And this is tremendously important because the British elite had decided that having their own nuclear weapons and not depending on the Americans to borrow the technology or to borrow the weapons was tremendously important. And indeed, both the Labour government and the Conservative government agreed on this because the atomic bomb, of course, had taken many years to develop. And in fact, the Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee had organized for the atomic bomb to be developed in secret. In fact, even some of his own cabinet didn't know. And so this was a symbol of Britain's, the elite's determination to remain a superpower, as we will see that will be perhaps a little bit more difficult than they assumed it was going to be, because as perhaps you know, having a nuclear weapon makes a country much more powerful. The 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council are those 5 countries which are which officially possess nuclear weapons. The following year, 1953, is best known, but for the last time that the United Kingdom had a coronation. New queen then, Queen Elizabeth, became queen in 1953, which was also considered to be the first major television event, because millions of people watched it on television. And you can see a few young people having a bit of a party because of the coronation. And I've also included here a South African stamp from the time, or perhaps commemorating it. No, from the time. And this is just to remind you that Elizabeth was not crowned just Queen of the United Kingdom, but also of Canada, Australia, South Africa, Newfoundland, and a few more. This was still an empire, and we shall see that what happened to the British Empire is one of the major themes of the post-war boom. I've chosen 2 events from 1954, both of them not directly involving government. Or perhaps they are really. In any case, these are the 2 events I've chosen. First of all, the Montagu case, because at this time it was illegal to have a homosexual relationship between men. And in this case, Lord Montagu was arrested and sent to jail for 12 months. Now, during the Second World War, things had been a little bit more lax, but certainly after the war, and in particular in London, the police had clamped down on homosexuals, and this was one of the worst times in Britain to be homosexual. The suicide rates were very high. People had to make sure that they didn't keep names and addresses of their friends at home. If you receive a letter, you read it and then you burn it, because if the police came to your house and found phone numbers, for example, they would go rounding up the homosexuals that they could. And one of the things about this particular case is that because it was a law, of course, it got on the front pages. And this was part of a very slow movement to begin to debate whether it was reasonable to send homosexuals to jail because they were homosexuals. And indeed, it helped lead to the establishment of the Wolfenden Committee, which discussed this question. And the Wolfenden Committee had two interesting things about it I'd just like to mention. First of all, is that this was a committee established to discuss homosexuality and prostitution, which were considered to be 2 questions of morality and government. So you can see where they were coming from. And secondly, perhaps rather surprisingly to people today, one of the institutions which was encouraging the government to make homosexuality legal was the Church of England. The Church of England believed that homosexuality was a sin, was immoral, but many things which are immoral, like infidelity, for example, are not illegal and you don't get sent to jail. And so the Church of England played a rather interesting role there. The other event that I've chosen is the Television Act. This is a law which will lead to the end of the BBC monopoly and allow the establishment of private television, of commercial television with adverts on it. And so the BBC has never had adverts and still doesn't have adverts today. This transformed television and also transformed radio, no, not radio yet. Radio is a monopoly of the BBC until the 1970s. Also transformed entertainment in general. The following year, apart from the slightly anecdotal poster there that I put on the left, which is simply to sell cigarettes, and 1956 was the year when the health minister was asked if it wouldn't be a good idea to have a campaign against smoking, and he replied, "Oh, no, we're not going to have a campaign against smoking." So just to show you how things have changed. And on the right is an important and symbolic event in the crisis of the British Empire. So what happened? Well, you can see in the picture that there are two countries who have come out rather badly out of the battle. The British lion has lost its tail, and the French cock has lost a lot of feathers, and it is the Egyptian Sphinx who has won out. So what is this all about? Well, Egypt is the country which borders the Suez Canal, which was built in the 19th century and is tremendously important to world trade, because if you don't go through the Suez Canal, you have to go around Africa, which is a long way. For a long time, the Western powers had controlled the Suez Canal, but because of the Egyptian government, President Nasser, wanting to put pressure on Western powers for other reasons, they decided to nationalize the Suez Canal and so control who could pass and who could not pass, probably tax the people who passed through and things like that. This was considered to be unacceptable by France and Britain, and yet they didn't really want to declare war on Egypt or anything, and so they had this rather clever idea, or it appeared to be clever. They got together with Israel, and they said in a secret meeting, France, Britain, and Israel, they said, okay, Israel, you invade Egypt and occupy one bank of the Suez Canal, and then France and Britain will arrive with soldiers to keep the peace and to keep the two sides apart. And they wrote all this down in a secret protocol, the Protocole de Sèvres. Unfortunately, the thing about secret documents is they get out, and this became better known, and the British Prime Minister had to resign, but this was a few months later. Meanwhile, the British came across another problem. That is that they had decided on this military adventure to protect British imperial interests, the Suez Canal, but they hadn't thought of getting the Americans involved. And so the British Prime Minister received a letter, the most incredibly polite letter from the President of the United States, saying, oh, we know it's a very hard time for you, and I think about you, and my wife thinks about you. And if you don't withdraw your troops from Egypt, then we will not be able to support you in this and this and this and this, these things that you needed us to do on completely different questions. They withdrew the troops. Tremendous victory for Nasser in Egypt. Nasser became the hero of African nationalists all across Africa. And the British elite began to learn that they were no longer a superpower, that if they wanted to go and have military adventures and control bits of the world in the interest of Britain, they had to have the agreement of the United States. Moving on to the following year, 1957, this humiliation of Britain as an imperial power continues, will continue more or less every year for quite a while, in that this is the year when Ghana became the first African country to gain its independence from Britain. And you can see there the two flags, the flag of Ghana, and underneath the imperial flag when it was a British colony, and you can see the name of it there, GC, the Gold Coast, a little bit like the Côte d'Ivoire. And I think this is an important symbol, because when you name a country the Gold Coast as a colonialist, it really does give the impression that you don't care at all about the people who live there, or the culture of the people who live there, or the language of the people who live there, that you're just interested in the gold. And so I think it's quite a good symbol of the attitude of the empire. And of course, they're tremendously important, the first African country to gain its independence from Britain. And in every other African country, there are groups of nationalists. And, maybe we could do that too. And sometimes it takes a long time, whether it's in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, which was Rhodesia at the time. But this will be the beginning of a long, long series of countries gaining independence. And I certainly won't be giving you the list, because there's huge number of them, but that's what's going on. This is also the year of the rise of a radical movement, the campaign for nuclear disarmament. There's one of their earlier marches became a very big political protest movement of a sort that they perhaps were not used to. Lots of folk music, lots of direct action, occupying Trafalgar Square and elsewhere, and definitely linked to the counterculture and the radical culture, which will continue a little later with the movement against the Vietnam War, because although, of course, the United States was the main protagonist, apart from Vietnam, in Britain, there was also an important campaign against the Vietnam War. 1958, I chosen first of all the riots in Notting Hill to symbolize one of the important changes that is going on. Many, and you can see there that the newspaper has chosen this to do this photograph, which is half a white man and half a black man. So what happened? Well, after the Second World War, a large number of West Indians from Jamaica, Trinidad, and so on moved to Britain, especially to the big cities, because there was a big demand for workers, and indeed the British government and the health service, for example, went out to the islands and said, please come and work in Britain. Very often the Jamaicans and West Indians who arrived had a very idealized view of Britain, and certainly were not expecting racism. And in fact, they discovered that there was rather a lot of racism. I'll try to put, there's a very, very, very good and entertaining television program about it. I'll try to remember to put it on the blog. And sometimes the racists will get quite violent, Teddy boys and in particular beating up black people. But what was different in 1958 is that the young black men fought back. And so when the racists came around attacking black people, and in particular mixed couples, black and white together, were always attacked. It's something that terrifies racists. Then they fought back, and there were, for several days, there was a big riot in Notting Hill. So this brought the question of racism into the front pages of the newspapers, and this whole question of racism and anti-racism will be central to British society since, and also pretty important for popular culture. This is also the time of a radical reform of the House of Lords. For the first time in 1958, you have women in the House of Lords. And for the first time in 1958, you have in the House of Lords people whose father was not a lord. That is to say that they are made life peers. That is, they are made a lord just for their lifetime. They can't pass it on to their children. And the government appoints them. Now, the government appointing the upper house is not, it's not completely democratic because these people are not elected, but of course it's much more democratic to have an elected prime minister choosing the lords rather than people being lords because their parents were lords. In 1959, there's another election, and the Conservatives are going to win again. For 13 years, from 51 to 64, the Conservatives will be in government, and there you can see they are advertising. We still build 300. We still organise the building of 300,000 houses a year. These are not all public housing. This includes private housing too, as I remember. And this is the poster of the Conservatives. Life's better with the Conservatives. Don't let Labour ruin it. And I think that they have a television there, which in 1959 is still well, not quite a luxury, but certainly not everybody has one. Indeed, when I was at school in 66, 67, 68, probably about half the class had a television, very often rented. In 1960, again, I've chosen two symbolic events. I can't choose too many, we don't have time. One is the case of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Now, Lady Chatterley's Lover was written in the, much earlier, in the 1920s, or perhaps just before the 1920s, and was banned in Britain pretty much immediately. And then later on could be sold in an expurgated version with the sex scenes missing. And in 1960, the Penguin Books decided to publish the full version, and they were taken to court. They were taken to the tribunal by somebody who said it was by a group who said it was obscene. and illegal under the Obscenity Act. And there was a court case, very, very exciting court case, where the defense of the publishers brought in authors to explain what is literature, why this is literature, and it's not obscene, even though it talks in great detail about sex. So it's a symbol of what the attitudes were at the time. And very, very famously, the judge in the case said to the jury, "Is this the kind of book you would want your wives and your servants to read?" That he was so much part of an elite that he was convinced that the normal thing to have in your house was servants. But of course, it's a tiny minority activity. In any case, Penguin Books won, and Lady Chatterley's Lover could be sold. Of course, that's just one novel, but it's a symbol of what is changing and this very slow tendency for the state to get less involved with what you do in your personal life. The other event was a speech. This is Macmillan, the Conservative. He may not have been Prime Minister when he gave the speech. I'm not sure if he was Prime Minister or Foreign Minister. You'll have to check that out. I think he may have been already Prime Minister. And he gave a speech in South Africa, The Wind of Change. Again, a wonderful, wonderfully polite speech, where he says, you know, he's talking to the South African Parliament, which only has white people in it, because the black people are not allowed to vote. And he's very, very nice to them. He said, "Oh, you know, you are our favourite people, but we cannot support you if you won't give black people the vote." And it shows that he has understood, and the British elite in general has understood, that black nationalism, African nationalism, is not going to go away and cannot be defeated by military force. And indeed, the rest of the decolonization in Africa with Britain happened without there being a major war. In France, you had the Algerian War. There was no major war for decolonization of the British. Why not? Were the British elite lucky? Were they smarter? Those are very, very difficult things to test. But although there was violence in Kenya, in particular, there was terrible torture of the nationalists. There was no large-scale war like the Algerian War. We move on to 1962, and we see a new kind of law, an act to make temporary provision for controlling the immigration of Commonwealth citizens. Before 1962, any Commonwealth citizen from India, from Australia, from Jamaica, from Trinidad, who wanted to come to Britain to live, could come to Britain to live. They didn't have to control. There wasn't any control. In 1962, there was control. This is very much about the government reacting to racist voters and trying to tell them, we're controlling the number of black people coming here. Because when people spoke about Commonwealth immigrants, they weren't really thinking about white Canadians or white Australians or white New Zealanders, who have been very, very frequent immigrants to Britain. It was really about race and about racism. So this is the first law which limits that. And the following year, 1963, we have a new leader for the Labour Party who will become Prime Minister in 1964. This is Harold Wilson. We also have the second TV channel, the third TV channel being offered to the BBC. So you had the BBC commercial television, ITV, and now you have BBC One and BBC Two. On the bottom right, you just have a little cartoon about General de Gaulle refusing the British the chance to join the European Economic Community. And it's the following year, then, indeed, that Mr. Wilson becomes Prime Minister, and it's often asked whether he tried to impose a new leadership style, and here's a symbol of that he is being seen with the Beatles, where certainly in the past Prime Ministers might be seen at the opera, but certainly not with pop music, which was generally not respected among the elites. Harold Wilson also famously spoke to pipe Apparently he preferred cigars at home, but he smoked a pipe because it made him seem like an ordinary working class family man. Although he was from, he wasn't from an elite background. And he also would wear a very cheap raincoat. Again, he had this idea of having a man of the people look about him. And this was fairly new. This is also the Commons vote to abolish capital punishment. In fact, if I remember correctly, they voted to suspend capital punishment, but then it was never brought back. The suspension was continued. So there has not been capital punishment for a good while. I can't even remember the date of the last person executed. It's not 64, it's a few years before. In 1965, the Conservatives brought in a new leader, and they were feeling a need to compete with the popular image of Harold Wilson as an ordinary man. And so for the first time, I think it is for the first time, they brought in a leader who had not been to a private school. Private schools are very important in British history, and the first thing you need to remember is that there are a lot of myths about British private schools. For the last 50 years or probably more, around 7% of British young people have gone to private schools, far lower than in France, because private schools are far, far, far more expensive than in France. In France, you can go to a private school and the teachers are sometimes paid by the government. In Britain, you have to pay the teachers. So you're talking about, really, you need to be rich to go to a private school in Britain, which is not necessarily the case in France. So they brought in a new leader who had not been to a private school, so a man of the people, almost. This is Edward Heath. This is also the time of the Race Relations Act. Now, the Race Relations Act made some kinds of discrimination a civil offence. That is to say that if you were black and you went to a shop and they refused to serve you because you were black, you could go to a lawyer and ask to take them to court, and you might win. So a very, very mild law against racism, but to be fair on the British government, this was probably the most advanced law in Europe at the time. This is also the year when the Labour government decides to phase out the old grammar school and secondary modern school system. Since 1945, everybody took an IQ test at 11, and they were separated out. 25% went to the grammar schools and would probably end up in university. And 75% went to another school and would not go to university, would definitely not go to university. And this system was replaced with the comprehensive school system, the college unique. But remember, this is Britain, so it was not decided in 1965. It was begun in 1965, but each region decided separately, and it took at least 10 years or 15 years. And in fact, there are a few places which still have grammar schools today, but only a very few places. The comprehensive schools were very popular with working class parents. And so although the Conservative Party for a long time said, well, we don't like comprehensive schools, we like grammar schools, the Conservative government never brought back the old system. 1967, two big changes. The first is that this is in fact an advert for a committee which is pressurizing for a change in the law about homosexuality. And that's just a symbolic illustration, because in 1967, a new law was passed which meant that for men under 21 in private, it was now legal to have a homosexual relationship. And that meant that people no longer had to be frightened of prison. It meant that the suicide rate came down. And it also meant that you had a slightly better chance, because this was now legal, being considered as acceptable. You had a slightly better chance if you were young of your parents being understanding about your sexuality. Now, it's very important not to exaggerate the liberalism of the 1967 Act. A very large number of people supported this new law because they thought the poor homosexuals, we don't like them, but it's not right to send them to prison. This was absolutely not a a sign of generalized acceptance of homosexuality. Most people said, oh, I don't know any homosexuals, because of course all the homosexuals were being secret about it because it was dangerous. And therefore people could say, oh yeah, I know what homosexuals are like. I see them on the television. This is what they're like. They're very extreme, etc. And gradually, as it became safe for homosexuals to say what their life was, then people gradually began to understand that they had just been ignorant and stupid. And today, well, it was a conservative government that brought in the law for gay marriage in Britain. The other big event of, so that's the Sexual Offences Act. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. The Sexual Offences Act, which is the law which makes homosexuality legal. And this is also the year of the Welsh Language Act, which gave the right to people living in Wales to use Welsh in public services, libraries, governments, courts, etc. That gave the Welsh language an official status within society. That's half an hour. I'm going to stop there, and I will be continuing in another capsule quite soon.